And so the story begins with an Akan man, born in the Ashanti Empire, who was enslaved and sold in the British colony of Massachusetts, where he would be renamed Onesimus. Now, Onesimus would go on to introduce the Western world to a form of juju, the term a lot of people use to refer to Ogden, that would change Western medicine forever. It would impact my life and your life and literally everybody you know. And after doing this, he would win his freedom back from his enslaver, who you may not know by name, but you're gonna definitely be familiar with what made this man famous, because it's a trip. Onesimus was purchased by Cotton Mathers, the son of Increase Mathers, who was the president of the University of Harvard, and as a result was a major political, religious, and intellectual figure at the time. Now, since Cotton would spend most of his life under his father's shadow, he eventually found a way to make a name for himself. In fact, he had this kind of obsessive drive to make this name for himself. And now one of the things he did so that he could make a name for himself and be respected by the people around him was the purchasing of another human being in the form of Onesimus, which was at the time a bit of a requirement or a status symbol for saying that you are accomplished and you are upper crust. So picture Onesimus, right? Or before he was Onesimus, a man that was born free in what is today Ghana. He had all the prospects of life ahead of himself. He had a community, he had the opportunity to eventually find a calling or a career and make a name for himself and fall in love and start a family and enjoy all the rights and customs of his land and his ancestors, which kept him safe, healthy, and free, right? Now, 7,700 kilometers away on the other side of the world, a crusade was being launched. And at the end of this crusade, 14 women and about 6 men had been killed under accusations of participating in black magic or witchcraft. In this side of the world, things were changing. Massachusetts was a colony under the control of the Puritans, and the Puritans did not believe in herbs, they didn't believe in roots, and they didn't believe in rituals. All of this was classified as the work of the devil, and this crusade was being led by Cotton Mathers. Now, the man from Akan land was kidnapped at a young age, placed on a boat and sent to that side of the world, to the Massachusetts colony, to be enslaved by Cotton Mathers. Now, soon after the witch trials, a smallpox epidemic broke out in Massachusetts. In this time, smallpox epidemics were very normal, to be expected. And one of the things that made it particularly deadly was that this society had no answer to the smallpox epidemic. But as the citizens of Massachusetts, shortly after the Salem witch trials, began to die one by one and find themselves falling ill, Cotton Mathers noticed something that other Bostonians had began whispering about. Cotton realized that a lot of the deaths were happening among white members of the society he lived in, and that the black members of society tended to not catch smallpox at the same rate. And so one of these days he sat down with Onesimus and they had a conversation about it. And Onesimus said the reason he himself can't catch smallpox was that when he was small, his arm was cut open and fluid from an infected person was placed inside of it, and that this was required throughout his village to assure that the virus does not kill the members of that community when it comes about. Onesimus showed Cotton the scars on his arm related to the inoculation. And around this time, a lot of the slave merchants had become aware that Africans with these types of scars were less likely to become sick or die from what we now understand are viruses. Cotton, who had a relatively high opinion of Onesimus's intelligence, took Onesimus's word and began writing letters to the other whites in the elite corners of Boston society. Now, here's the catch. One of the first people killed in the Salem witch trials was a Caribbean woman by the name of Tituba. Tituba had studied the art of Obe, also known as Ubi, from an older practitioner in her time in the Caribbean. And because of this, she was very adept in using natural medicine to heal illness. In fact, practicing this art was exactly what got her accused and executed in the Salem witch trials that Cotton Mather's had led. Now, the hypocrisy of the whole thing didn't faze Cotton. In fact, he went around Boston parading Onesimus and preaching about this idea of inoculation that had been introduced to him by this enslaved man. Now, predictably, Boston society fought back. To their defense, this guy had convinced people to kill your wife, had convinced people to kill your neighbor, had convinced people to kill your father and your mother. So imagine this person parading around town trying to convince you to do an African blood ritual. The white society at that time called it black magic. They called it voodoo. They called it sorcery. They had even accused Onesimus of brainwashing Cotton and floated the idea that Cotton was being used to convince white people to infect themselves with smallpox so that the blacks would eventually take over. Benjamin Franklin's own brother had even written a letter against this entire idea, specifically stating that Africans were liars and that Cotton was being deeply misled. But Cotton didn't slow down. Despite the backlash, Cotton had eventually inoculated 242 people. And of the 242 people he inoculated, 6 died. And so Boston society's response was to throw a grenade through his window with the words, "Inoculate this," written on it as a warning. Now here's the issue. Onesimus was very aware that eventually this anger was not going to be aimed at Cotton, and that if somebody was going to suffer, it was going to be him and the other enslaved people in Boston society. It wasn't until the Revolutionary War where Boston, the whole of Massachusetts, and in fact all 13 of the American colonies had decided to rebel against their colonial master, the UK. During the fighting that ensued, the smallpox epidemic got worse. And it wasn't until George Washington had made the decision to inoculate the soldiers under his command that the Americans were able to gain the fighting edge over the British, as smallpox and other preventable diseases were the primary causes of death during the war. Because of George Washington's success, inoculation went from being branded as sorcery and African magic to something that the whole of America grew to accept. Now, as a reward for his help in bringing this about, Cotton offered Onesimus a chance to be converted into Christianity. Onesimus refused. Rather, he asked to resume the life that was interrupted by his enslavement. He wanted his freedom, he wanted to get married, and he wanted to live on his own, away from Cotton and all his madness. Not having much of a choice at the time, Cotton granted Onesimus his freedom, and Onesimus went on to have all of the things that he had requested in a new world that he and his African black magic had made safer than they had found it.